community channel, I do a couple of different interviews with different people. So yeah, here with Michael Jones. He has a Christian apologetics channel called Inspiring Philosophy, with a wide range of different topics and really interesting aspects to Christian apologetics that I think one of the most unique apologetics channels on YouTube. Like, you have a lot of really interesting ideas that aren't normally talked about from a lot of different.
I'm going to do more of that. You know, you and I were just talking before we were recording. I have more interesting ideas that a lot of people don't talk about that's going to be on my channel soon. So yeah, I'm going to keep doing more of that.
Right. Okay. And just as a first topic that we can get into, you recently had a debate with Stephen from Destiny from, and you had that on the Modern Day Debate channel, right? And debating theism.
Debate's a strong word, but yeah, it was a debate. Yeah, I was so James, the guy who runs the channel, actually helped fund my flight to debate Aaron Raw back in June. And when he was out there, he's like, I really want you to debate this guy called Destiny. You know, he's like a big following. He's really sharp. He's quick on his feet. I'm like, let's do it. And so then, like, a month ago, he's like, you want to set up the Destiny debate? I'm like, yeah, of course. And he's like, okay, Destiny doesn't like to be told too far in advance, so I'll let him know like a week or so out. I'm like, that's fine, you know, and then we'll get an actual date nailed down. So he told him, and he asked Destiny, you know, like, do you want more time to prepare against him? Because he's going to bring arguments you never heard of. And Destiny said no. So then I actually then watched his Twitch stream prior to, because he was actually streaming on Twitch before the debate even started. And I went and watched that, and he was so unprepared. He didn't even know who I was, so I was on camera. So he had no idea what was coming.
That seems to be kind of a theme, it seems like, with some of your debates, because I guess like a similar thing would happen with Aaron Raw, where like he was just returned from a fight.
That wasn't entirely his fault. He thought I was a different Michael Jones, so he got a little confused. He thought I was a different Michael Jones, because it's kind of funny, because I told Ezra, like, oh, tell him I'm Michael Jones. I'm the guy that he helped give some advice on his Ken Hovind debate, or on his Hovind debate. Well, he had given another Michael Jones, Dr. Michael Jones, advice on debating Eric Hovind. So he thought I was that. And so then, like, a week before, he realized it was me. And I guess he, you know, it wasn't entirely his fault. There was some misunderstandings there. But.
Yeah, but I don't know. It seems like quite the advantage for you, where the people you go up against just have like little or no actual understanding of what your arguments you're going to be presenting are.
Well, I mean, Matt Dillhunty, Tom Jump, even G-Man. I mean, you know, a lot of them don't, because, you know, and when it comes to the atheists, in the atheist community, they have sort of turned the term Christian apologist into a derogatory term. To them, when they hear the term Christian apologist, they immediately think stupid. So I own that. I go around and that's what I tell everybody I am, because I want them to think I'm stupid. And it works so well sometimes, I feel like. I tell them I'm a Christian apologist and they just assume stupid. And then they go into these debates and they're completely unprepared.
Yeah, it's so great too, seeing it, because like, especially you did the debate with Matt Dillhunty last year, and it's so funny because like all the comments are saying like you, the Christian theist, were the one presenting all the scientific evidence, and Matt Dillhunty was only just presenting his own anecdotal experience and just working off of feelings and intuition and things like that. It's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Before the debate, we were in the live room talking, and I asked him, "Did you get a chance to watch any of my videos before this debate?" He's like, "Nope, I didn't watch anything." All right, your funeral. I mean,
yeah. And I guess I can kind of see why he might have expected that, because like hosting the Atheist Experience channel, he has a lot of experience actually going up against a lot of Christians and just working out his arguments for how to like tackle each of the different arguments that are commonly presented. But this has no real experience, I guess, working with against your arguments that you had, because you actually had the data and evidence for it. And that's the thing, like not everything can just be argued against from a series of spotting the fallacies or picking out fallacies. It's actually like for an empirical question like this, there's actual evidence that can be had to support it or not.
Well, you also got to study your opponent. I mean, Tom Jump has got a small channel, but when I debated him, I listened to hours of his debates prior to that, because even though he's a small channel, I'm not going to underestimate him. You don't do that. And so I try my best to not do what something like Matt Dillon does, where he schedules too many of these debates and he can't prepare for them. I try to maybe do one a month, and that's my limit, one a month.
Yeah, that's smart. So what is it that goes into like you're choosing which debates you're going to go through? Because I'm sure you get like plenty of different requests and things like that, but which ones are the subjects that you're willing to go into and put in the time and research for?
I mean, a lot of subjects. It's more about who, because I get asked to do a debate with an atheist probably once a week, but it's just some guy who has got a Facebook page, or, you know, it's like, and so I can't debate everyone. And so I've limited myself to like, if you got like, I want to say 10,000 subscribers or more, or got a popular blog or something, yeah, I'll debate you. Or if you've been on atheist experience, sure. But I just can't debate everyone. So, and I also don't want to do too many. So I try to limit people who have audiences like me. You know, I think that's fair. It's for the same reason Sam Harris probably will never debate me. He's too big. Why would he waste time on a small fry like me? So,
How do you go about choosing the topic of the debate? Is that something you agree upon beforehand, or back and forth or something?
Yeah, what I'll do is sometimes people will come to me and they'll be like, they want to debate this topic. Like Tom Jump asked Modern Day Debate if he could debate me on If God Exists. And I said, sure, no problem there. Sometimes I'll go to like for example, when I debated David Fitzgerald, I went to Cameron and said, I've been studying this topic a lot lately. Is there anyone if you wanted me to come back on your channel, I know you mentioned that, why don't you find someone to debate me on this topic? So he found David Fitzgerald, and that went well. Same with what
was the topic with David Fitzgerald?
Is Christianity a mystery religion, or is Christianity influenced by paganism, those types of things? Same with G-Man. James said I want to do a debate again, so I gave him a topic. I should have been more specific because I don't want to go after low-hanging fruit too much. And so I got some bad feedback from my donors saying, don't waste time on those people. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I should have specified to James, get someone that's a little bit more, reputable.
Yeah. And what I like about you too is like, you're not like, you're willing to debate a lot of different types of people too. Like you even debated Ken Hovind on I think evolution. Like, and what's great is you actually did so from a biblical kind of direct perspective rather than a scientific kind of perspective, because honestly, I think that's where a lot of people are, I guess, more apprehensive towards the evolution debate is, but they're holding up scripture as being primary, and anything that goes against that is going to have kind of a secondary aspect or secondary value to it. But you were working primarily from within scripture.
Yeah, and I wanted to do that because creationists don't typically ever get to do that. And I like doing things that a lot of people haven't done before. That's why I try to make unique videos. And I don't do just another video on the Kalam. That's been beat so much. Why do it again? So I try to do that. But my debate with Ken Hovind, I call my penance for once buying into his crap. So it was my penance to repent against falling for that. When I was, before I even, back in 2006, 2007 time period, just after I became a Christian. So that was my penance. But yeah, I wanted to give the biblical arguments because I knew he would not be familiar with all of the arguments I brought up, because a lot of younger creationists don't dive into that realm of scholarship that much.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating too. Like, especially there's a point where you brought up how people just have to assume that Kent Hovind has the ultimate authority on scriptural interpretation, just like exactly what he was calling you out for going with the scholarly consensus for it.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It proves that he doesn't really, he's not against gurus. He just doesn't like the competition. So he wants to be the only guru. So when you hear Ken Hovind say we don't need gurus, what he's really saying is we don't need other gurus.
We just need me. Yeah. Yeah, and that seems like kind of a strong, kind of what he's going for with his project. Because I don't know, at least within his community, it seems like it's very much tied to only what Ken Hovind says. If you go against that, then you're going against God's word. And there's very close kind of minded community there. But thankfully, I think with the what is it? There's a quote from Niels Bohr that science progresses one funeral at a time. I think there's a similar aspect within apologetics where there's this kid on a Modern Day Debate channel. I think he's 12 or 14, maybe around 12, and he was debating the historical reliability of the resurrection, and it seems like he even debated for theistic evolution, and I think he draws a lot from your work to support that.
That's because I tutored him.
Oh, really?
I was tutoring him like once a week last year. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, you could kind of tell. So just like through online tutoring, he reached out to you or something?
Yeah. His parents hired me to do some tutoring for him, and I was happy to do it. So yeah.
That is so cool. Yeah, and I think that's kind of like, I don't know, this is a side topic, but I think that there's sort of a future in education there, where like parents will pick out the specific teachers that are able to actually interact with the students individually, rather than this kind of like more corporate classroom style that's going on. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of a side topic. All right, so I wanted to go into your theistic argument that you laid up against destiny, since that's probably one of the, I guess, the newest argument for God's existence in kind of the panoply of different apologetic resources that's out there. Do you want to maybe go into that kind of?
Well, I gave him 3 arguments. We only really talked about the first one, which is the digital physics argument. And basically, so I gave 3 arguments. One is a digital physics argument. That's just another like cosmological argument. It's another contingency argument. So it's like the Kalam. It's like the Leibnizian version. It's just a more modern version based on modern data. You don't have to argue for a beginning of the universe, because we can argue the whole universe is emergent. Okay, emergent. It's contingent. Argue for another contingency argument. So I laid that one out. I laid another argument from consciousness. It's just another modern form of the argument from consciousness. And then I just gave one from philosophy. So the first one he was really going over was the digital physics argument. We didn't really get into the other ones because, he was kind of overwhelmed, I thought. And so, but yeah, essentially what we're doing is we're just looking at modern data, like holographic principle, quantum cognition, and looking at these different ideas and showing, well, if the universe is emergent, the question we should be asking is, what is it emergent from? Or what is it contingent on? And so if you talk to physicists like Sean Carroll or, different atheistic physicists, they'll talk about how it emerges from information. I remember hearing at the World Science Fair, Herman Verlaine saying that. It's emergent from the universal wave function, which is extended in Hilbert space. And so then I just simply going, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, what is this thing? And basically, what they're describing is basically the same thing that other physicists has described as the same properties of a mind. So I'm just connecting the dots here that different physicists are doing and, making an argument out of it.
Right. And it's funny because I recently appeared on Think Club's channel to do a debate, and I was actually arguing in favor for the simulation theory. And I was using kind of your different arguments that you've laid out there, like digital physics, quantum, the Bell's violation of Bell's inequality in quantum entanglement. And my third one was the seemingly retro causality that's implied through the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. Now, of course, I was arguing not in favor of theism exactly, but at least just in favor of our world being contingent upon some larger or underlying reality, in which, like, for the simulation hypothesis.
Yeah.
Now I wanted to ask, when people like Sean Carroll or different physicists say that the fundamental reality is information or information based, something like that, is there kind of maybe a misapprehension from most people in thinking that this information has to be mentally based? Because I've heard some physicists say that, like, when they say information, all they're meaning is like distinctions between things. So like a bit where it's on or off, that's technically information, but that's not information that necessarily requires a mental with a mental reality that's holding that information in there. Exactly. It could just be like a distinction within it in its physical form.
Yeah, well, I think we're confusing epistemic information versus ontological information. So yeah, what you're saying, it is information, and physicists do talk about that, which is why I don't just say the universe emerges from information. I explain what that means by information. The underlying universal wave function. So there have been some experiments which have shown that this is a real ontological feature of reality. It's just not an epistemic tool we use in quantum mechanics. The wave function really is ontologically real. So that would make the distinction that I'm referring to ontological information not epistemic information like a bit switching 1 to 0 type thing. And when, Herman Verlaine talks at the World Science Fair, he's saying that space-time emerges from this information. Well, if we're talking about space-time, we're obviously talking about ontological aspects, because space-time is an ontological thing.
Okay, so like the bit being on or off would be an epistemic understanding of information and not an ontological understanding?
Yeah, because there's no like real ontological thing there. It's just different states of a bit. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of a better analogy. Here's one. So writing a note on paper. Okay, so if the ontology of what's happening is there is ink in paper. Epistemically, there's a message there though, that you can see, but what the matter that's composed of is just a piece of paper and ink. But epistemically, you get information. I'm talking about some sort of underlying information that's ontologically that the paper itself is emerging from.
Oh, okay. So the actual ontology of the universe is based on something more fundamental, that it is, say, like the universal wave function or something like that. All right. Okay, that makes much more sense then. So, and you seem to like connect I guess that universal wave function to consciousness in some way. Do you want to maybe go into how those are actually connected there?
Well, I mean, if there's information, if the universe is underlying information, we should ask what it is contingent upon. So is it contingent upon like some sort of computer? Because I would argue information itself just can't exist. It implies that it's contingent upon something else. So if space-time is information, it's contingent on something more fundamental. That's just a basic contingency argument. There has to be a first cause. There has to be a substance underneath that everything is contingent upon. So some would propose a computer, some would propose a mind like I do. And so what I do in the argument is I make a connection to quantum cognition. So Diederik Ertz and other physicists have argued that the properties of the mind, the way we think and reason and have emotions, these should be modeled using the formula of quantum mechanics, because we can't really model these things in classical ways. So you can't say I have thoughts behind other thoughts, or I have emotions next to my other emotions, because they're really not like that. But he has been able to model these mental properties in terms of the way we describe quantum mechanics. So he says, we can readily model the aspects of the brain or of the mind using quantum mechanics.
So would that be like like saying you have a superposition of differing desires or something, like differing, like there's a desire to eat and I also have the desire to sleep, something like that. These are two differing desires. And then I guess consciousness is what collapses one of those desires into something that is acted upon.
Yeah, I mean, but we're using this in an analogous way at this point.
Right.
So like, you're thinking like, I want to eat let's say you're at a buffet and you have all these possibilities of what you could put on your plate. And so they're all sort of like in a way, superposition of possibilities until you, the conscious observer, make a final decision and collapse to what you're going to put on your plate.
Right.
And so, that's kind of like a good surface level of what he gives a lot more detail in his papers, obviously, but that's kind of like a surface level understanding of what he's talking about. So I just put two and two together. If the properties of the mind can be readily modeled using quantum mechanics, and the universe emerges from the same underlying features, like universal wave function, quantum mechanics, okay, then what the universe emerges from resembles a mind, and it probably more likely is a mind. So that's basically the digital physics argument in a nutshell. If we're going to say the universe is emergent, which most physicists agree now, the question is, what is it emergent from? And the properties of it resemble a mind. And I think this is a powerful argument, because someone like Matt Dillahunty will respond to cosmological arguments who says, yes, we know the universe began, but we don't know what it began from. We have nothing that can help us infer what it could began from. And I go, actually, we do, because if the universe is emergent from underlying quantum information and the properties of the mind can be readily modeled using quantum mechanics, just put two and two together. The universe emerges from a mind.
Making like an inductive argument for what we already know to be the case for this one circumstance, and we can kind of draw the parallel there and assume there's something at least analogous or similar in that.
No, it's not proven, obviously. That's why we're making an inference. We're connecting dots. So, I mean, I can't prove it, but I can show that what we emerge from really does resemble a mind if you look at it a little bit more in depth.
Right. And that was kind of, I guess, Destiny's only real rebuttal against your argument was that you're kind of assuming some sort of intentionality behind the universe, or you're using words like simulation or God that maybe have some sort of, at least for us, an assumption of personhood to these things, or intentionality for creating a simulation that is not necessarily something that can be drawn from the evidence. Do you think that there is actually any implications of intentionality via the case?
I mean, if it is a mind, then yeah, I think there would be some sort of, you could make the inference there could be some intentionality there. I think you need to make additional arguments to get yourself there, obviously. But I mean, it's not ruled out right then and there. He seems like, from what I've gathered from his previous conversations, is he tends to very much not like those ideas. Yeah. And I don't think we should rule them out to begin with. I think we should look and see, if there's a mind behind the universe, then it's plausible that there could be some sort of intentionality within the universe. But I mean, it could also be the case the mind is just, a deistic type God who doesn't care. So there's no real intentionality there. He's just sort of spinning the wheels and coming up with something. So we need additional arguments to get there.
All right. I've heard other apologists like Braxton Hunter. He makes the argument that because there was nothing else like determining God's actions, that it must have been intentional, because like there's nothing that could have been done outside of his outside of determining him to do things against his will. So like it kind of had to be intentional, especially paired with the argument that like the Kalam cosmological argument, where something began to exist, the universe began to exist. And so if something began to exist, it had to have been caused by something. And if that's something, it had no ulterior causes for its actions, then it kind of must have been self-caused by God.
I mean, you could also argue maybe the thoughts of this God are random too. So, that's a possibility. I would say it has to be intentionality. I want to try to be open to the other possibilities. All
right. I'm curious as to the many worlds hypothesis. Is that a sufficient, I guess, defeater for your argument that maybe like, while our world in which there is kind of consciousness collapsing wave functions that's going on, if all of these differing worlds are all happening on Hilbert space, does that kind of, I guess, diminish our assumption of, I guess, uniqueness or specialty within human life for our own particular world? Like if there's so many other worlds that are also happening on Hilbert space, does that kind of raise objections for our own ideas of our world as being special?
Yeah, so this is Sean Carroll's interpretation. So, he's not a theist. He doesn't agree with me on this, even though I use a lot of his data. He holds to the many worlds interpretation. And so that's kind of where he goes. And so basically what the many worlds interpretation is that there is a wave function. Yeah, we get that, but there's no collapse of the wave function of one thing. Everything in the wave function is another world that happens. So, it's like there's a world where I decided to be an atheist. I guess there's another world where, every time I make a choice, I guess you could say, two worlds branch out. Every time you make a choice, two worlds branch out. That kind of idea.
Or even when it's not even choices being made, but like say you have a half reflective screen or something like that, and where a photon will either bounce off or pass through, that's a diversion of worlds where both things happen.
Yeah, and you can see how big that could just get in terms of like worlds. We're talking like, quadrillion upon quadrillion upon quadrillion of the worlds, and we're still not even at 0.001% of how big this would be. That's insane. And to me, it's just on the surface, it sounds so ad hoc that in order to deny the reality of the observer and there's collapse, you have to posit this so many worlds. It's astronomically insane just on the surface level. But mathematically, it does make sense. It could really be the case, and we shouldn't dismiss something just because it's weird. But I don't think the many worlds interpretation is a complete interpretation, and there's two reasons why. So one, I'm going to share my screen now. If that's okay.
Yeah.
So let me share this thing because I need to show kind of like a graphic to show you what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
So this is a bell curve. Do you see this on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a bell curve. And so when we do quantum experiments, nothing is deterministic. It's probabilistic. And so there's a probability of where something will end up. You know, it's far more likely to end up in the middle of the bell curve. So if you say, where is the particle? I'm gonna measure to find out where the particle is. The probability of it being more in the center is higher. Whereas it on the outside, it's far less likely to be here. But you know, in every 100 chances you look, and if you look 100 times, about 2 of the times you'll find it in this area. You know, it's more 34% times you'll find it here, 34% you'll find it here. You get the kind of idea. Yeah. Quantum mechanics is probabilistic. Now remember, the many worlds interpretation says everything equally happens. Right. All of the different things in quantum mechanics equally happen. But that doesn't make sense with quantum mechanics on the surface, because you're saying that quantum mechanics says some results are more probable than others. So the ones in here are more probable, but the many worlds interpretation says these all equally happen.
Right. Okay. So like if you have a screen that maybe is 75% clouded, so photons will only pass through 75% of the time, you'll have 3/4 of the time it passes through and 1/4 of the time it doesn't. And if you only do it once, that still diverges the world into 2 different realities, one where it does pass through and one where it doesn't, which doesn't really match with the bell curve exactly, or the probabilities of it.
Yeah, this is called Born's rule. You know, you're far more likely to get these results than others. But but the many worlds interpretation says that no, all of these should be equally happening. So we shouldn't be confirmed. You know, that means there are some branches of worlds where they don't confirm the Born rule. It shouldn't happen. There shouldn't even be a Born rule because everything equally happens. And so that's one of the main problems of the many worlds interpretation, is that it cannot derive the Born rule. You know, it cannot calculate the probability because it says everything has equally happened. The other thing that's a problem with the many worlds interpretation is something called the preferred basis problem. It's called I'll repeat that, the preferred basis problem. And what it says is, you know, when we look at a wave function, it's a little bit more messy. It's like spaghetti. You know, it's like everything is overlapping, interacting, different spaghetti strands are sort of like wrapped up around each other. But the many worlds interpretation would look at the wave function as like a bowl of marbles. These discrete independent worlds all by themselves. But that's not really what the wave function is. The wave function is like spaghetti. Everything overlaps and is entangled. So we really are in this giant ensemble of worlds. Things should be overlapping. We should be going in and out of different worlds. Things should be kind of fuzzy. Like when we look at something, you know, like there should be like particles splitting in different directions type thing, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I can kind of see, like with the double slit experiment, where it seems as if the particle is going through both slits and then interfering with itself and then causing this ripple effect on the screen behind it. If we assume the many worlds interpretation, that interference pattern wouldn't really show up, because every time, like, it would always go through one slit or the other, but never like both.
Well, I mean, I think the double slit experiment is compatible with the many worlds interpretation. I'm more or less talking about the wave function prior to collapse. What you see on the results in the double slit experiment is the result after collapse. So that's a little different. But just the wave function itself would be overlapping, interacting to these types of things. In other words, you know, if the Mandela, I found this kind of funny. So there was someone of the many worlds interpretation who actually used this argument on me one time. But he believed in the Mandela effect. That conspiracy theory that things change, and he was using that as evidence for the many worlds interpretation. And I actually thought about it, you know, like, if he is right, that's a good point, because the worlds are supposed to overlap and change things. You know, like in one world, Nelson Mandela died, and maybe there was some sort of like, you know, overlapping happening there. But I mean, I think that's just a conspiracy theory.
I've heard some people also using it in support of the simulation hypothesis, where like there's these different simulations, or where they had to like change history, different ththings like that.
That type of thing, yeah. I mean, I think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's based on very bad data, as it is, because like, you know, one of the big things about the Mandela effect is that it used to be the Berenstain Bears, not the Berenstain Bears. And I'm like, I never remember the Berenstain Bears. It was always the Berenstain Bears. My dad read those books to me all the time as a kid. He always said Berenstain Bears. I remember seeing the A. So I just think a lot of that Mandela effect is just people having false memories. Yeah.
Or even just like simplified memories. Like when you read, like for most like Jewish names, you read Stein at the end. So like,
exactly,
if you would just like rudimentarily reading Berenstain, you would like automatically fill in the typical spelling, EIN, rather than
Yeah,
stay.
it's like so like one of the effects I have is Folgers. You know, people say there used to be a D in Folgers, and then the Mandela effect happened and took it out. But think about it. We know a word called fold. So if we hear fold, we immediately think in our brains the D's got to be there. But no, not always is. We just have sort of inserted that in our memories because it makes sense to us. But that's really, it never was Folgers. It was always Folgers. So I don't think Mandela effect is a good argument for the many worlds interpretation. And I won't name the person who used this, but
right.
And I thought it was hilarious.
As an argument, it has too many other alternate hypotheses that work just as well, maybe even more so, based upon what we know from the unreliability of human memory.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry. I'm icing my back because I'm basically 80.
You're what?
I'm icing my back because I'm basically 80. But go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let me see. There's something. Let's see. From. Okay. There is some like I noticed you sometimes reference Donald Hoffman, and he seems to be making a similar case to you in regards to idealism. He doesn't call it idealism. I think he refers to it in his book as conscious realism, but it's basically the same as idealism, where it's placing consciousness as most fundamental, and then all physical properties emergent out of that.
Yeah, that's idealism. I mean, it's objective idealism. He probably doesn't want to call it idealism because most people think of subjective idealism, and neither him or I are a subjective idealist.
Okay. So what is the difference there? So would like George Berkeley be a subjective idealist?
Yeah, George Berkeley would be a subjective idealist. Excuse me. So a subjective idealist, you basically are saying that, you know, the world that we see is just sort of like a mental construct we've applied to it. That doesn't really mean it's objectively real. Whereas an objective idealist is sort of saying, no, the world really is mental, and we're discovering the mental world as it is. So it's objectively mental beyond our minds. Whereas a subjective idealist just sort of looks at the way we see the world as sort of like these forms we oppose upon it.
I see. Well, okay. Well, then one of the things I actually used in my debate was the quantum entanglement kind of problem, where it seems as though upon measuring entangled particles, they like almost load a property of like spin up or spin down based only once we actually make that measurement. And I guess that would be sort of, I don't know if it would just be subjective idealism or objective idealism, but the purpose of, or the implications, at least, that I was making from that, it is that the property of spin up or spin down only are loaded once we make the measurement. Prior to that, it's just kind of a superposition of a spin up or spin down.
I mean, a good way to know if you don't know the difference between an objective and a subjective idealist is simply this. An objective idealist is going to argue from quantum mechanics. A subjective idealist is going to just use pure philosophy because they're not going to care about external world type things beyond the mental reality that we're sort of sharing and experiencing. Whereas an objective idealist says, you know, we're part of a larger mind that we're basically exploring.
Mm-hmm. Well, that would still somewhat at least fit within George Berkeley, because like I think Berkeley says, like when rebutted with, I think an example of like, okay, when you light a candle and then you leave the room, when you return to the room, it doesn't have that same position as it was previously. It's now been melted. And like, in order, if like idealism is true, time only exists when there's a subject to experience it. But I think George Berkeley states that like time still exists even when we're not experiencing it. But
the reason why he says that is because he says God is always sort of watching, like God has like giant eyes and is looking down, and I don't take that view.
Right, and I think that probably doesn't work exactly in quantum mechanics, because like if consciousness is what collapses the wave function, and God is kind of the universal consciousness that is always all-knowing, then we would never see wave function prior to collapse or interference patterns or anything like that. Right. All right. So that's very interesting. It helps me understand both those positions much better there. I have heard some different objections to both the simulationism as well as some aspects of idealism, and I've gotten it from Christians themselves, actually, because there's certain things that don't make as much sense within the idealist I guess, framework or paradigm that are sort of fundamental. One of them being, I guess, like the historical reliability of the resurrection. So if like the simulationism is true, then history sort of has a defeater. Like there is actually the possibility of 10 weeks ago, the simulation was created and all memories and histories were falsely implanted into minds and also into our history books and things like that. And so like if Christianity rests upon the proposition that on a certain date, God resurrected Jesus, then that proposition itself, while it would have been preloaded into our history, wouldn't necessarily be like accurately true.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's it's kind of a weird objection because that's true even on substance dualism. That's true even, I mean, God could have just created the world ontologically as an object and did the same thing. I mean, what's the point? It seems like it's a ridiculous objection that they realize is true for their own position. Why is it all of a sudden a problem for idealism?
I see. Well, I guess under the assumption of, I guess, time happening like even without us being here, where objectivism is kind of always happening, then that wouldn't necessarily have that problem because you'd just assume that where we got to right here and now is just from the past reaching to this point.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm still an objective idealist. I think there really is a real mental world that we're participating in. I don't think that, it's just, as again, I don't see how this is a problem for idealism because it's not, the difference between what objective idealism and substance dualism is just what is the underlying reality made of. It has nothing, it doesn't really change anything with regards to theological implications.
And even like for me in arguing for the simulation theory, like that was one of the objections was that like if simulationism is true, then we can't really trust our sense experiences. But my response to that is like if like we're in a simulation, then the things that we've been embedded into our like histories and past sense have all been like intentionally placed there so that or at least part of the simulation that we I don't know like we still have a not just as reliable, but it's like even if like Jesus wasn't raised from the dead at a certain date and things like that, it's still within this simulation where that is the history to it. And so we have to kind of like act accordingly because that's what the simulation was created for or something like that. Like I mean, you could say it for the Big Bang or something like that as well.
Just think of a video game. If you're playing like World of Warcraft, that's you're going to be able to express your senses in there. I mean, you play certain. I think people play certain storylines in that game. And are the storylines real in that world? Yes, and there actually are real rewards in that world because they don't apply outside of the world. Is interesting. And on top of that, I think this makes a really good, strong data against the problem of evil. Because, if you kill someone in World of Warcraft, it's bad in that game because you may lose some items. You may, same in this world. If you kill someone in this world, it's really bad in this world. But when you get on the other side, you get to the other side of eternity, and both people are in heaven. There may be easier to forgive someone because you realize that was not the fundamental world. This is the more fundamental world.
Yeah. Oh, looks like you cut out somewhat. You're kind of frozen there. Uh-oh. Let me see. Sorry, everybody. I can check on the chat while he's returning. Wow, getting a lot of responses. If anybody wants to raise questions for Michael, you can tag me, and I should be able to see them and move them over. Just make sure you tag my just Bevry in the channel. That should work. I'm going to. Oh, there you go. Oh yeah, you're back. You're muted though.
Yeah, I don't know what was going on. Your audio just started breaking up.
Oh yeah. You just kind of froze on screen. Anyway, yeah, you were mentioning the kind of a resolution to the problem of evil in that, like, what was experienced as negatives within this reality, once we kind of exit out of it, gives us a more broader perspective on like the reasons behind things. And it's funny because that was one of the objections during my debate was like, okay, why would our simulation creators create a world in which there was conscious suffering that was occurring? And I kind of raised the typical Christian response of like the character building theodicy, but I nested it within, I guess, like a naturalistic frame where, and this is something I actually think might be plausible, where if we are to technologically progress to a point where we can basically create anything with like serious ramifications to them. So like I could create, like, say I have the Star Trek, I don't know, materializer or something like that. And I could just basically download and print off a nuclear warhead or something like that, just because of technologically capable of, in the same way that people are able to like 3D print parts for guns and then put them together themselves without having to go to any sort of outside third party for that. If people can do that for nuclear warheads or these like highly dangerous diseases or viruses, things like that, that's a world in which we would not want to give that sort of technological capability to just anybody. We'd only want to make sure that the people that were in such a world were ones in which they wouldn't use that in a negative way. And so in order to kind of protect the future existence of humanity, there's kind of a reason to put people into circumstances to test their character fortitude by putting them in these kind of differing like hard life circumstances and seeing how they respond to that. And if they respond negatively to that, then maybe they have to go through more further experiences just before we can trust them enough to live out in the real world. Because like if you give somebody a small amount of power and they use it to manipulate and to just work selfishly all for themselves, that's not somebody that you really want in this kind of post-technology society, and where anybody can just create anything to work towards their own selfish good, but rather we'd want people that were more altruistic.
That's a good argument. Building on that, I remember Dark Matter made a video like saying, you know, if God really existed, why didn't he put secret scientific information in the Bible? And I'm like, think of the scientific information we got 100 years ago and think about how fast technology progressed. Do you want nuclear weapons in the hand of Vlad the Impaler, Nero? I mean, like, I think God was very intelligent waiting to when technology was revealed, because, you know, I don't trust a lot of those ancient people with a lot of the weapons that we have now. Because a lot of the mentality back then was war is what is normal, peace is bad. And now we're in the mindset that, no, as societies, because we have mutually assured destruction theories out there, that no, war is bad. And so I think God was quite intelligent in waiting to give us certain scientific advances, because, you know, humanity was in a dark place for centuries, and we're only now starting to come up from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you were to give like the people 1,000 years ago the I don't know, like a genetic theory for how to cure polio or something like that, and they use that capability to, I guess, create some sort of like super virus that could kill off all the people that they didn't like. Certainly a possibility that could have occurred. Yeah, that's a really interesting argument there.
Yeah, think about how racist people were up until about the 1800s. And just that, I mean, it still was bad. It still is bad in a lot of ways. I mean, but we're clearly much better now. I mean, I think as a species, we're much better, and we're getting better than we were 200, let alone 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, and at least like the people with such power are kind of like responsible to their constituents and also to other powers of like different nations and things like that. All right, cool. All right, there's the I went through your case for the soul just recently before this, and I was surprised with how much you like really pack in there, and that's kind of the thing with a lot of your videos. You like pack it in argument after argument after argument.
You know, I'm redoing that series because I'm gonna add more data in.
Oh, really? Well, any special insights you can give to the audience for like new stuff that you might add in?
Yeah, I'll tell people. I don't try to hide that kind of stuff if it's already out. The data I'm hiding for the winner is I am hiding now because I still want to fact check everything.
Sure.
So I have some videos coming out in like February, March that I'm keeping a little secret right now because I'm still fact checking everything. I was talking to you about it before we got on the air. But for the Case for the Soul series, basically, I'm going to add some, for example, one area I'm going to add in is experiments done with psilocybin or LSD. And so from a materialist perspective, if you give someone LSD or psilocybin, it's going to cause hallucinogenic experiences. And what we do observe is people's heart rate increases, blood flow increases. We can observe this. So if everything is happening in the brain, we should expect brain activity to increase as blood flow is increasing. Well, numerous studies have done this, and they've all gotten the same results. It's the exact opposite happens. Brain activity decreases, actually. Some 30, 40% sometimes. Or maybe it's just 20%. I need to check the number on that. But yeah, so that was actually a prediction made from physicalism, scientists that were pure materialists, that brain activity would increase, and the exact opposite was found. So I mean, by that logic, we should say that physicalism was falsified in that way.
I see. So like if there's the assumption that consciousness is due to like the brain functionality, then we would expect higher subjective experiences of consciousness would be correlated with higher like observations of the brain functioning through like higher blood pressure and different things firing on all cylinders. But in fact, the opposite has been shown to be the case.
Yeah, and there's actually been also some studies on consciousness itself. They put people under general anesthesia, and these people still report conscious experiences. There's actually peer-reviewed studies have been published on this. So consciousness is not going away when we put people under general anesthesia, and that's another prediction that was made from the physicalist side that has turned out to be false. So a lot of this stuff is, there's a lot more data I need to add in.
Does that somewhat counter like the Stuart Hameroff, Roger Penrose kind of theory of consciousness, where it is the emergent from the you use some of their data, but I know Hameroff is an anesthesiologist, and so when they're put under anesthesia, that's kind of the like end of consciousness, or like the temporal blockade to consciousness. So if it's happening even when I forget the microtubules, that's it. When the microtubules are inactive, then at least from their perspective, from their theory, consciousness would also no longer be active.
No, well, they argue consciousness, the neural correlate is something called gamma synchrony. I'm not sure if that's the case. I don't think that it could be. I'm not entirely convinced on that either way. I don't think it matters though. But they argue that the neural correlate of consciousness is gamma synchrony. Gamma synchrony does stay under general anesthesia. So I don't think it would falsify their view. No, I'd have to look more into it to be sure though. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I know like some idealists like Don Hoffman kind of raises his objection to the Hameroff Penrose theory is because it's still being done under a physicalist assumption that like you have to have these microtubules as they actually exist in objective reality, and then the changing of the microtubules is what produces consciousness. But
exactly, and that's why I reject it. That's why I reject integrated information theory. These are all idealist. These are all physicalist theories disguised as idealist interpretations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was something like I think at least the digital physics argument kind of refutes integrated information theory in some sense, because like if information has to be contained within a 3D space, like 3D objects, and objects themselves cannot be within, like don't actually fit within a black hole in a 3D space.
Well, I don't think integrated information says that. I don't think it necessarily says that. No.
Okay.
No, it's a little bit more complicated, but it tries to say collapse is consciousness. So quantum collapse is consciousness, and I think that's just wrong.
Like when quantum when the collapse of the wave function occurs, that's a conscious experience.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's different from what I've heard of it as. Yeah, I have a pleasure of doubt in the chat I interact with regularly. He's an integrated information theorist. So
yeah, maybe I'm confusing with what Penrose says. But
Yeah,
Penrose
I think
and Hameroff are integrated information theorists. I mean, again, I need to look to double check all this.
I'm pretty sure that is the Penrose and Hameroff theory, that the collapse of the wave function is what produces consciousness. And
yeah,
I know Penrose explicitly goes into that in his book, The Emperor's New Mind. I'm not as familiar with integrated information theory, so sorry about that, everybody.
It's not my thing either. I looked at it a while ago, and I was like, I'm not really convinced by this, because I think consciousness is fundamental. I don't think consciousness is integrated information. So I tend to just move towards more like Hoffman's view or Stapp. I mean, I'm very much in line with Henry Stapp.
Well, that's going back into idealism. That one of the Christian objections to that is that there are, like, within the Christian doctrine, there are certain things that are objective and physical, and things like you have the mind and the body. But if the body is just a product of the mind, then the body doesn't really exist. And so, can you really say that Christ was incarnated into a body if he was really just incarnated into a symbol within the mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's about the ontology and what is real within that world. I mean, Christ really did die in our space-time. He really did have a body in our space-time. Just because the underlying ontology is that it's not real physical particles there, but information to give the simulation type world its construct type, that kind of idea. That doesn't mean Christ really did die for our sins in space-time. It doesn't mean it doesn't have real effects. I think people like this comes from William Lane Craig, for example. I know he uses this, and I'm always like rolling my eyes because he uses it all the time. And I'm like, where are you getting this from? Again, if you play a video game, like Final Fantasy VII, that's the last video game I played. So it tells you how long I've been playing video games. Not a long time.
Well, I can't even imagine William Lane Craig playing video games either.
But in that world, their Earth type area has this sort of like life force to it. Now, that's not real for us, but in that world, that life force is really real to their world, and we really do operate with those rules. And so they really have to sort of play the world by their rules. Like the whole premise of the video game is like the bad guys are sort of draining the Earth of its life force, and we need to stop it. It's like, so they form this sort of like environmental terrorist group type thing to stop the bad guys from draining the Earth's life force. And that's really real in that world. If they don't stop the life force from being drained in that world, the world is really going to die.
Right.
They really have to kill Sephiroth and stop him from using the planet as a giant spaceship to travel around the universe. That's another thing that happens in the game. Really complicated, if I remember correctly.
I see. So at least just to draw it to our universe. So like within our world, we have these concepts such as physical and body and different things like that we're referring to things within our world that, like, sure, these things that we're referring to might not have ontological reality beside, like, in themselves, but are actually emergent from something underlying. It still doesn't really change that we're still referring to the same thing.
Yeah, they're confusing objective with fundamental. Just because something is emergent, that doesn't mean it can't be objectively true. Okay, so just because our reality is not fundamental in and of itself, doesn't mean it doesn't have objective facts about it that are still true. Jesus really did die for our sins in this world. That's an objective fact that we believe as Christians. So that's something that's really did need to happen within the construct of this world. So as much as I respect Dr. Craig, sometimes I think his objections against idealism are just not well thought out. And it's not like he hasn't really delved this deeply into this. I mean, if idealism is true and he doesn't think Christ really, Christ really had a body, then I tell him to walk in front of the street tomorrow and see if a car really does hit him. Are the rules really going to still apply in this world? Yes, because there's still objective facts about this world. You don't want to walk in front of cars. Sin is still an objective.
Yeah, if you're playing GTA 5, you also don't want to walk in front of a car because it's going to run you over and you have to restart the mission, something like that.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, cool. And like the other thing that I've also heard from like certain Thomists that transubstantiation would be kind of falsified if idealism is true, or not falsified, but it would no longer really, like, there would be no actual presence there within the body. But I know that you subscribe to panentheism, which I guess is part of the orthodoxy. But like, so
yeah, it's part of Greek Orthodox. It's built on that. I mean, so they built on like early thinkers like Gregory Palamas, even people like Philo of Alexandria, and then someone like Callistus Ware, who's a Greek Orthodox theologian, says this is panentheism. This is basically what they've been teaching. We're just putting a term to it.
And is panentheism somewhat tied to idealism in some sense, or is it just that like our world is contingent on God's existence, and like maybe I guess there could still be things that happen. Well, probably not. If God's omniscient, then everything that does happen would have to be happening still within like God's awareness of them happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, if objective idealism is true, I think panentheism is just a natural result. Now, there are different forms of panentheism. I'm a weak panentheist. I don't take Hegel's view or anything like that.
Right.
But yeah, I think panentheism just naturally results because we're exploring a real mental reality, and that would imply it's contingent upon a mind, and that's panentheism right then and there. So that's why, and so I don't think it's a problem for Christianity because comes from Greek thinkers as well. So I mean, yeah, not an issue. So I think a lot of Christians kind of have like a knee-jerk reaction against idealism because it's not something they've heard before. And but when I start talking to them and I start explaining what I mean, they tend to sort of go, okay, that's not as bad as I thought. Same with evolution. When I start explaining to them, they start to go, okay, I see what you mean.
Right. Yeah, and you have a somewhat interesting perspective on evolution that, of course, differs from a lot of the like young Earth creationists and things like that. But it also kind of differs in some sense from like the normal like Darwinistic understandings of evolution. And what is it? Process structuralism?
Yeah, it's biological structuralism, process structuralism. Essentially, it's structuralism. And so it's a little different. What we say is that, I mean, I basically explained through an analogy. So if neo-Darwinism is true, if you rewind the tape of life back to zero and start over, you wouldn't get human life again. You wouldn't get, anything like humans because it all just came about by random chances, just luck. You may not even get life again. Under structuralism, if you rewind the tape of life back to zero, you would get human life again. You started over again, you get human life again, or something very similar. It may not be Homo sapiens. Maybe it's a descendant from some sort of like African primate, or I'm sorry, a South American primate, something like that. But you're always going to get something like humans. And so structuralists look at the forms of life the same way that we look at the periodic table of elements, is that the universe sort of like is fine-tuned to bring about all the different types of elements we see on the periodic table just as a natural result. That we don't think that, iron came about by like a happy accident, type thing. It's a natural result of the laws of the universe. We say the forms of life are the same way, that the basic body structures, the basic plans we see are a natural result of the universe. So if from a theistic perspective, I say, God fine-tuned the universe not only to sustain life, God fine-tuned the universe to create life in the many different forms that came about.
Right. Okay. So is it like it's like the forms that might emerge for different species are built upon like the niches of the environment in some sense. So like the anteater's elongated nose and tongue would be a species that would only evolve in response to, say, like ants and ant colonies being in existence. So like there's the ability for them to be satisfied through ants, but by eating them. But like even if ants didn't exist in another universe where you would have a similar like termites or something similar to ants or termites that would be there, you would also have the similar anteater elongated nose and tongue in response to that as well.
Yeah. I mean, we do see a lot of convergence in the evolution of life. So I talk about this in my videos. We've seen a lot of different forms converge. Like, for example, I found this out, just a couple of years ago, but the three-toed sloth and the two-toed sloth are not directly related. They're converged onto the same form from different lines. I mean, their closest, you would think that the two different types of sloths, their closest, relative is each other. No, they converge to that point. Right. Same with a lot of different sea creatures. There's a lot of convergence in the different aspects of life that we see.
So I can kind of see two ways in which to interpret this process structuralism. And one that's more bottom up and another that's kind of top down. Like you could kind of, I guess, conceive of like within Platonism, there's say like the form of the anteater or the form of the man, something like that, in which when like through the process of evolution, they're coming closer and closer to this form. And then once they're in a highest degree to that form that they're capable of within the environment, they're going to kind of retain that form and not like evolve even further. And I guess you could, and then from the, I guess, bottom up approach is there are the niches, like I guess from the typical neo-Darwinism, that there are these different environments and niches and other objects within that environment. And then the animals will evolve to fit that niche in the same way, like ants, just because they're smaller and able to work in coordination with each other. And then from that, you're also going to get anteaters, just because it's a dense source for calories or it's a rich source for fitness for the anteater to actually go through and eat ants. So they'll evolve according to whatever is like they're at their whatever their
structures that life sort of like evolves into that's already sort of set there. Like you throw a bunch of hydrogen in the early stages of the universe, it'll eventually sort of go into different niches per se, where different clusters will form helium, and then from there you'll get oxygen and all the other elements. I mean, you're not going to get the same result every time. It depends on certain environmental conditions to bring about the certain element. Same with the evolutionary theory of life, is that we say that there's different structures that are sort of embedded within the universe. And when an organism enters it, it's going to sort of move towards that basic structure. Now, it's not going to be the same every time. I think there's a lot of flexibility, but you're going to get the same basic structures. Like if you're going to have an animal that's going to eat the tops of the trees, you're going to get a giraffe. But if you're during the days of the dinosaurs, you're going to get a brontosaurus, a long neck type creature. So you could see convergence in certain ways like that.
Right.
So you're going to have a creature that's going to enter the niche of like a triceratops from a mammal perspective. You're going to get a rhino.
I got you. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Then that's what like you can kind of see these parallels in similar forms based upon kind of their like broader environment and circumstances that they're within. Now, so I guess of those kind of two ideas of like almost the Platonic view and then the bottom-up approach, which would you say that you kind of fit more within?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a Platonist. I'm probably more of a scholastic realist in terms of that. So we try to it's kind of like a middle ground between Platonism and nominalism. I mean, to me, that subject has never really been it's my favorite thing to study, and I don't really, I'm not very dogmatic when it comes to that either. I hear good arguments for nominalism, and I'm like, yeah, that's done. I think those are good. And then I'll hear good arguments for Platonism, and I'm like, yeah, those are good. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way, especially like I'd say I'm somewhat of a nominalist in regards to in regards to like numbers. I've heard certain good arguments for like how you can kind of build up numbers aside from like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And then for other things, like especially for like morality with G.U. Moore and others, that there's certain, and like C.S. Lewis himself being a somewhat prominent Platonist. A lot of good arguments both ways, but yeah. All right, I have a question from the chat. What is your favorite argument for God?
The one we were talking about in the beginning of this, the digital physics argument. I think that really hits home for people a lot of times, because you start to see that it takes the contingency argument one step forward in arguing that what the universe emerges from is a mind.
And it's a lot more readily accessible to a lot of people, especially like with how much we have like video games, and like we have this kind of contingent realities just within our normal everyday experience. And so being able to kind of get that understanding of like, oh, in the same way that I'm playing Mario in this situation, my soul is kind of like playing John in this larger situation.
Yeah.
So what is the like soul? Like what is your understanding of what the soul is, especially in regards to like?
Well, the soul is a term thrown around a lot to mean different things. So it's kind of like it could mean one thing. It could mean the conscious, self-aware observer, or in some circles it doesn't mean that. They would separate the mind from what the soul is. So the mind is the conscious observer, whereas the soul is like your personality, your thoughts, your emotions, your dreams, your desires. It's a collection of information contingent upon the mind. And so the soul evolves on that definition. It changes over time. And so when theologians talk about a soul-building theodicy, that's how they're defining soul. So it depends on what you mean by it, really.
Okay, so I've heard like some people separating, like there's the ego, which is the experiencing self in the here and now, and then there's the self that I guess is kind of like underlying that in some sense, where like you've built up these experiences and reactions to all these past experiences, and that's kind of like what's driving your instinct towards or away from certain things, which I guess might be located within your soul. And then there's others that I've heard, like Jung, who it seems like uses the soul, or he uses the capital S self, and he uses that in reference to like your extended self across time. So like you might have the ego, which is that individual like here and now experiencing self, and then you have your past and all the way into your future. So there are like you're being driven towards your say like who you're meant to be in your future self, and that would be also part of your extended soul in some sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it really depends on how you define it. Because everyone defines terms like soul, mind, ego differently. So when I redo my series, I'll try to be a little bit more definitive on what I mean by those terms.
Mm. I know you're. I don't know. You've at least so far like interacted somewhat within Orthodox theology, and it seems like a lot of the different things that you kind of build off are similar in a lot of ways to that. Are you aware of the theology of the nous that they sometimes refer to? I think it's something akin to like there is a component to ourself that is capable of experiencing the numinous, so like God or anything that are like supernatural, and this is a component to the human person. And
yeah,
then,
I mean, yeah, you're talking about the phenomenal and the noumenal.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I don't think Kant's right on that. I don't think we cannot experience the nominal. So yeah, I would agree with him on that. I disagree with Fetalists.
So as an idealist, though, wouldn't everything be phenomenal?
And no, I wouldn't say everything that we physically experience through our sense perceptions. Yeah, would be phenomenal. But I don't think there are. I would say there are nominal, abstract truths that we can be aware of. I think this is what Paul's talking about in Romans 2 when he says they have the law written on their hearts. I think, we obviously can't prove that in some sort of empirical sense, but, I think we still have access to noumenal truths in that sense.
Oh, that is interesting because, like, I know Kant, he was actually kind of a fan of the moral argument for God's existence, and I wonder if that would kind of fit within.
I mean, he was, but he also attacked it in certain ways. I mean, Kant was an interesting character because he really tried to find middle ground between like rationalists and empiricists.
Right.
So, he said, yeah, the empiricists are right in this way, but you're wrong in this way. And you rationalists are right in this way, but you're wrong in this way. So he tried to, like carve like a middle ground type thing. And in some ways he was pretty successful, but he also became a fatalist, that we really can't. He drew a distinct line between the phenomenal and the noumenal and said, okay, we only experience phenomenal over here. The noumenal exists, but we can't know any of it. It's all beyond us. And that's obviously self-defeating because how would you know that unless you already had access to the noumenal to know that we can't have access to the noumenal? I mean, you'd have to know, you have to have this objective standard that you could step out of and go, oh, yes, all humans can only see the phenomenal and this noumenal stuff over here. They can't. I mean, it's self-defeating.
Yeah, there's a quote from Wittgenstein, like, in order to draw a distinction between what can and cannot be known, you must first know everything in regards to that subject. And so, that's an easy response kind of to Kant's kind of split there.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so, I think Kant was very, very intelligent. He did some very important and great things for the study of philosophy, but, obviously I don't agree with him because no two philosophers agree on anything.
Yeah.
I mean, no two people agree on everything.
Yeah. All right. There's some, I really recommend everybody kind of watch his Case for the Soul, just because there's a lot of like good arguments that you kind of present that like a lot of people I don't think are really aware of. One of them being the neural binding problem, which I think is quite fascinating. Do you want to kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so they've been looking for example, what we experience now is a unified perception. So you see your computer in front of you. It's a shape. You see the color. You see, you experience it all as a unified thing. But in the brain, we've noticed that information is processed differently. So like where the brain would process color is different than where it processes shapes and sounds and sights and all. It's all different. So, neuroscience said, well, where does the brain unify all this into unified experiences? And they looked everywhere, and there is no area of the brain that unifies perceptions. And the argument is that from idealists and substance dualists is that, well, that it doesn't. That's because the brain is just sort of collecting information, but it's the mind that is unifying it all and experiencing it as a unified experience. So the neural binding problem, because it was never solved at a physicalist standpoint, it's likely to imply that there has got to be something beyond the brain you infer something beyond the brain that can unify experiences. And so the obvious response is, well, maybe we just haven't found it yet, or maybe it's somehow undetected in the brain somewhere. And I'm like, okay, so to avoid idealism or substance dualism, an undetectable mind, you're positing brain activity that's undetectable. So you just put yourself on the same playing field. Why even do that?
Right. Yeah, it kind of fits with some of the responses to quantum mechanics, that postulating some sort of hidden variables to this. But that's the thing, if they're so hidden and we can't really measure them, like how is that different from kind of postulating some immaterial thing that we also can't measure?
Yeah, exactly. And so, I would understand you'd do that if you were really committed to physicalism, but physicalism, I think, just denies basic intuition that, we have conscious experiences and these aren't emergent, that these are not reducible to smaller parts. Consciousness is, irreducible. That's pretty intuitive. That's the only thing you can prove right now, is that you are conscious and experiencing stuff. Why would you deny basic intuition when there's no reason to? There's no evidence that consciousness is emergent from the brain. So I think physicalism, they posit something undetectable, but they also deny intuition.
Right. And that's actually kind of something that George Berkeley did in response to the materialists of his day and age, where like, okay, you're postulating this material reality, which is causing this mental reality to occur. But like, why do you even need to postulate this extra thing? It's almost non-parsimonious, because like, I mean, I can explain everything purely within idealism. Yeah, for him, subjective idealism, but still that everything can be reduced down to, I guess, like Schopenhauer is sort of an idealist as well. And his work, The World of Will and Representation. So like you have ideas, the things that we experience in our mental reality, and then also, I guess, will behind that as well, which is part of like who we are as consciousness and soul.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Yeah, there's something, at least for me, that has raised some objections to the idea of artificial intelligence as being a possibility, at least conscious artificial intelligence. What was, in fact, John Searle's Chinese room experiment, or not experiment, but thought experiment, where if, say, I'm placed into a room and I'm given a code book for how to respond to certain graphs or pieces of Chinese calligraphy that's written on paper, and then how to respond to that with other pieces of Chinese calligraphy. I could do so completely without actually understanding what the semantic meaning of the words and symbols are there. And like his, I guess, argument is that for machines like algorithms being run on computers or artificial intelligences, all that they would have is that looking at the logbook and then how to respond to things without actually having any sort of understanding of like, oh, this written text is in reference to a tree, and this written text is in reference to a dog or something like that. It's just responding to each of those. Anyway, my question, I guess, was where was I even going with that?
I don't know.
Yeah. At least it's a interesting argument against the, I guess, algorithmic assumption of.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it'd be really hard to even prove they were conscious, because you just have machine learning. I mean, it's
right. Okay, so I guess this is somewhat of a maybe even an argument against simulationism, where if a computer would not be able to have a semantic understanding of information being inputted into it, then that might raise make it impossible for human consciousness to be simulated upon such a machine, in which makes it so that in order to actually have consciousness being the underlying prerequisites for consciousness being within a computer would make it so that the computer itself would have to be, I guess, mental in some aspect. So whether it's a mind.
another good thing to remember is that computers are really good at doing things we suck at, and computers suck at things suck at things we are really good at doing. So I could walk over to the kitchen and get something out of the refrigerator and walk back. That would take very little brain power. For a computer, that takes a lot of computer processing to do that. I mean, they're just now getting computers to be able to do that, and they're still having problems. But I could not, do every single, run every single number, all these different mathematical problems in my head and come to a solution right away. But a computer can do that. So it seems like they just inherently are different because they process information different than we do. And I think that's evidence that they're not really conscious. They're just information processing devices.
Right.
They don't experience a conscious reality like we do. They process information. That's why they're really good at processing math problems, but really bad at, like pouring a drink.
Right. That's something that Donald Hoffman presents in his book, The Case Against Reality, is that for like what consciousness is, like what human consciousness is largely data compression into things that are simpler and easier to work through. And like through the process of evolution, our sense data is just only that which is necessary to kind of like survive long enough to genetically reproduce. That's kind of his route to idealism, is through our understanding of evolution through natural selection, wherein natural selection is only going to be favoring species that are tuned towards fitness and rather than tuned towards objective understanding of reality. So like if you were to put these two against each other in a competition, the one that's tuned towards fitness and ignoring the rest of objective reality would ultimately benefit greater than the one that's tuned to objective understanding of reality. But and I know there's a lot of like rationalists that kind of and skeptics too that kind of are not happy with his work that he's doing with that, because it kind of raises, like he uses that to I guess raise objections to our belief that what we experience as reality is objectively real in some sense. But yeah, where was I going with that? The sorry. Oh yes, I remember. Okay, so the aspect of data compression. There's Aldous Huxley. He had a kind of theory for the brain as the inhibitor to consciousness, and I think he was somewhat of a panpsychist or pantheist, where like all of consciousness is fundamental, and what we as brains are experiencing is just the limitation of consciousness. So like imagine like you have a whole 360 degrees of things happening around you, but the brain is only working on like 180 degrees in front of you, or even less.
Yeah, limiting type thing.
Right.
So there's a book called Why God Won't Go Away, where two neuroscientists basically argue the same thing.
And I guess that would fit mostly within a pantheistic worldview, or I mean, it could also work within a cosmic consciousness worldview, but it still places consciousness as fundamental in some sense. Yeah, that's interesting that the brain with it is just kind of like the limiting shades or whatever that only allows us to see what is most necessary for us.
I think it's more like subjective creating. It sort of creates like a subject within a sort of a conscious framework. So it's sort of like singles us out as like individuals in that kind of sense. And that's why we have the brain. It's a soul building theodicy. It's sort of building souls over time through this experience that will go on past this life.
All right. So that's interesting. The soul is actually going through this process and building up upon itself, rather than kind of this static thing that already exists and I guess outside of time. Maybe I'm misunderstanding dualism in some sense, but it seems like there's kind of the soul, and then there's the reality besides that. And so like there's nothing that you can do that can really affect the soul and under that impression. But maybe I'm misunderstanding dualism quite a bit.
I don't know.
I'll have to talk to Esther O'Reilly. She's quite the Cartesian dualist. All right, this has been really great. I'm glad we got to go through a lot of the different things that you've been working on and your different works and things that you've been doing on your channel. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this with me, Michael. I really enjoyed the kind of process of going through a lot of this type of stuff with you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. No, glad to do it. No worries.
All right, I'll see if there's any other questions from the chat from everybody. It looks like they had a lot of stuff going on while we were going, but I'm not sure how much. Okay, I guess there has been a lot of questions tagging me. I don't, maybe they tagged me incorrectly because I'm not seeing, I'm signed in under the wrong account. Give me 1 second.
Oh, that's why, yeah.
Sorry, guys. All right. I got to sign in under the Bevry channel. All right, there we go. Now I can see them all. All right. I have a question from Epic Christ. Some idealist philosophers like Kastrup believe consciousness is fundamental but lacks awareness. If your arguments work, why would one believe that this mind is aware? So
yeah, I think that's ad hoc. It doesn't make sense to me. How could we be consciousness but not aware? I mean, it just seems like you're trying to divorce what is just obviously the same. It just doesn't make sense.
I guess that might be like tied to like our unconscious. I know like people like Jung and Freud say that there is this unconscious that is working through us, and like we're not aware of what it's doing, but it's still like working within us in some sense. But that doesn't, would the assumption then be that our unconscious is actually conscious, but we just don't have access to the information that it's processing maybe?
Well, I think there's just information that we individually are not conscious of at times. It's just in our brain somewhere that we're not currently processing. I don't see why we have to process that it's in consciousness somewhere else. It's not in our individual consciousness.
Gotcha. All right. Our world is really similar to games, and someone could not say games are fake in a sense because the universe will not give you a frame until you look at something just like a video game.
Well, you could say that, yeah, they're real within their own individual world. So it doesn't mean they're real on this world's level. Like the rules don't apply here. Like it's like, if you try to if you have a rule in your house, you have to be all your kids got to be in bed at 9. That doesn't apply in someone else's house. It doesn't apply to the U.S. government. It's a rule within a deeper rule. It applies within that special framework. But when you step out and go to a higher level, it doesn't apply.
Right. So I guess then, like you could say that our universe abides by certain rules or laws of like nature and gravity and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these laws are going to exist outside or in other realities in which we're underlying or that are underlying ours. That is actually something I had raised against Donald Hoffman's argument for well, at least Donald Hoffman kind of raises the objection against simulationism in that given our limitations of reality, we can't really assume. My rebuttal to him was that you can kind of assume the limitations to our reality are applied to all other meta universes or underlying universes, but I'm not so sure you can really make that argument with any certain degree of authority or certainty, because like just because in this video game you're not allowed to run 30 feet in 5 seconds, that doesn't mean that like in the real world that's impossible, or in some other video game you're able to do that. Anyway, all right, Pleasure of Doubt says, in the psilocybin experience, what we see is overall brain activity decreases, but there is increased activity and connectivity in areas like the visual cortex, if he recalls.
Yeah, there is increased activity in certain areas, but again, that's assuming, again, going back to the neural binding problem, it's assuming that that's actually, everything is sort of binding together in unified experiences there. So there is intake, there is some sort of the sort of visual intakes, there is some sort of increased activities in certain areas, but overall brain activity is decreasing in certain ways. And also, I'd have to look at the exact studies, but if I remember correctly, it was a visual intake, possibly. But I mean, a lot of what's going to happen in these psychedelic experiences also going to activate areas that we would correlate with like imagination. or, like abstract thoughts, because you're not actually, visually seeing everything. I mean, it's actually there. This is why these are hallucinations. So, I mean, it was again, a shocker to a lot of physicalists, scientists that work in that field, because they were expecting increased brain activities in these other regions, and it wasn't happening.
So, like having the expectation that the parts of the brain that you have when you're doing abstract thinking or imagination weren't really showing up when under psilocybin?
Yeah, it was other areas as well. I mean, so yeah, some areas did show slightly increase, but overall, I mean, brain activity was decreasing, and that's sort of like the physicalist response to the neural binding problem. That, well, it's sort of, the brain is sort of somehow unifying all this information together. It doesn't need a specific area, but then why is brain activity decreasing for that?
Right. All right. IP, have you looked into R/K selection in evolutionary psychology?
No.
Okay, I think that has to do with like IQ differences among races, maybe, because he mentioned Stefan Molyneux, and I know Stefan Molyneux deals with that. All right, Epic Christ had another question earlier, but I can't scroll up too far. Sorry, Epic Christ. If you want to re-add it, I can ask him regarding your other
I got to
question.
go pretty soon, though.
Sure. Yeah. Let me see. I have a question for IP. If we can build a quantum computer and we simulate evolution and natural selection in a virtual environment, why can't intelligent agents arise from that?
Say that again?
So if you can create... if you can simulate evolution occurring, and maybe like
okay, intelligent. Well, yeah, I think you could. I think intelligent beings could arrive through that. I don't know if they would be conscious per se. I think consciousness is different than intelligence.
Right. Yeah, it'd be similar to like how your car might be able to quickly choose a pathway through GPS, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your car knows what the GPS is actually telling it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Last question. All right. All right. This is from Amir El Shafra to Michael Jones. You're wrong. The consensus of physics doesn't agree with you.
Yeah, I know.
I think that's a reference back to your T-jump debate.
Yeah, that definitely is.
Would you say that consciousness is the soul?
No, I tend to have been thinking the soul should be defined in the second way I define it, in terms of soul building theodicy, like your personality building up over time. So I think consciousness, I think the soul is contingent upon the conscious self.
Right. And so like you could say like building up certain virtues within you lead you to respond to certain like actions or respond to certain events in ways that are even kind of unconscious to you in some ways. And that wouldn't necessarily be like tied to like your I don't know, like for certain people like I've heard I think Braxton Hunter were talking about this, or maybe Jonathan Pressfield. No, not Pressfield. His sidekick there, that like when you're of a certain moral character, like you are unable to actually inflict like unnecessary harm on somebody. Like that's not something like, even though you like, I don't even know if it would be something that you're capable of doing. Like it might be inhibited to you by free will, but that it would still be something maybe you built up for yourself, this, or even like you can build up the ability to no longer like no longer always respond to alcohol in a way that is outside of your control. Like you can kind of build up your soul or character in a way that you're no longer inhibited by the presence of alcohol to the point of always having to drink from it. All right. And we got a compliment from Pleasure of Doubt. I do want to express to Michael that as a non-theist, I appreciate his overall approach to these discussions.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah, you're really great, especially in the way that you go through debates. That it's very respectable and do so in a way that is understandable to a lot of people in ways that it's easier for them to really grasp at least where you're going with your arguments. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining in. If you want to check out Michael, I have the link to his channel down below, and he's active on Facebook. Not so much on Twitter because Twitter's not that great.
No.
But yeah, so keep an eye out for what he's planning on coming out in the winter, and also he just released a video yesterday on Genesis. So yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. All right, thanks for joining. All right. And ending the stream.